Welcome to episode 5 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Real Health Radio. And today I want to talk about cravings and food addiction. I saw a meme by Dr Mark Hyman a couple of weeks ago that said sugar was 8 times more addictive than cocaine. I watched his documentary called Fed Up, which really vilified sugar and really blamed the obesity epidemic pretty squarely on its shoulders. And part of this was, or what he said, was because sugar is just so addictive. And I also remember another section from a different documentary called Food Matters. And there was an interviewee, I can't remember who it was a female, but she likened giving sugar to kids as basically rolling up their sleeves and injecting them with heroin. And I think this kind of sort of sensationalized way of talking about food is just becoming much more of the norm. I've been seeing it sort of more and more, and personally, I really disagree with it. And so when I was starting to put together this podcast, this was one of the topics I was like, I really want to cover this first and foremost because it's just so important. So today what I want to do is first off look at cravings and sort of how they work within the body, and use this as then sort of the foundation to then kind of transition into looking at food addiction and is it really a thing? How does it go on, etc. So let's start with cravings. And really, cravings have, from my perspective, 2 components to them if I'm kind of making some sort of generalizations. There's a physiological component and or then an emotional component. So when people come and see me, so often they'll say that I'm a slave to sugar or I'm a slave to chocolate, that they have these kind of really strong cravings. This can be all the time. It can be at certain times of the month. And from a physiological perspective, if someone's getting cravings for this reason, it's because there's not enough energy coming in. And this can be because the meal that they ate was too small. It could be because they've gone too long between meals. It could be that they're genuinely not eating enough calories over a day, but it's coming from an energy perspective. And this can still be happening when someone is overweight or obese. I think too often people think, well, look at them, they've got so much fat on their body, it should just be turned into energy seamlessly. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work like this, and the body really wants to protect this stuff. And so it's not just kind of effortlessly turning that stuff into energy. It will still be using and giving someone lots of cravings despite their size. And so when someone is then getting cravings, what are they typically craving? And if we think outside of the kind of weird and wonderful things that people crave when they're sort of pregnant, and just look at sort of more of the everyday kind of cravings, what people are normally craving are things that are calorie dense, are highly palatable foods that's kind of converted into energy very easily, things that people kind of barely have to kind of chew. So kind of thinking of like a McDonald's burger or a hamburger or chips, where basically you can get that stuff in and down very, very quickly without much kind of chewing and much effort. So things like that, or chocolate or sweets or ice cream. And really, if we're looking at it from a physiological perspective, and that's what's driving it, your body is really trying to prevent you from sort of starving. And again, this can sound crazy if someone is sort of overweight or obese, but at that cellular level, their body isn't having enough energy. So they're, in a sense, starving. And so what their body is doing as part of those cravings is trying to get that person to eat more, to bring energy to their cells, to keep them being able to function. And I think sort of a perfect example for this can be sort of around a woman's cycle. So most women will often experience the fact that they will get cravings sort of a couple of days up to a week leading up to their cycle, maybe the first couple of days of their cycle as well. And if I'm looking at the body, during this time is a huge demand on the body. There's lots more resources that are needed. It's the time of the month that I typically tell women that they should be eating the most of really any point within that month. So if they're getting those strong cravings at that time, typically it's from a physiological perspective of they just need to have more energy coming in. And that's not the only side of it, but it's definitely one of the first things that I think of. So then the other side of cravings is then looking at it from sort of an emotional perspective. So people are then using food in this scenario to sort of self-soothe. People are using their cravings or are getting cravings because they're wanting a distraction. They're bored. They're upset. They had an argument with their partner. They had some bad news at work, etc. So they're using food to deal with their emotions. And this is very much a learned behavior. I mean, I look at the way that sort of parents will often reward their children with chocolates. And it's not just about here's the chocolate. It's like giving the child the chocolate, telling them how good they were, how amazing they were. At the same time, sort of saying, oh, how amazing did that sort of taste, and sort of messing all of these things sort of up into one little package. So it means that then when someone starts to sort of eat chocolate, it's no longer just about the taste of it. It's about sort of the flashback to those emotions, those situations, even if that's very much at a subconscious level. So in this scenario, then these cravings aren't just about lack of energy, or might be kind of totally not about lack of energy, but are because of emotions. And what I often find in practice is people have a tough time deciphering between these two. And I would definitely say there's often a feeling of, well, it can't be because I'm hungry. It can't be because of energy. Like I've eaten a lot. I eat a lot more than my co-workers, or I have a much bigger lunch than others. And so because there's then the connection between what I eat and my weight, and people are so worried about their weight, that really sort of the natural default for most people is they want to believe that all their cravings are from an emotional perspective, because they don't want to think that maybe I need to be eating more. And so they try and blame all of this stuff on their emotions. So the way that I typically deal with it is I take the opposite assumption. And this is normally pretty easy for me to do because I'm looking at someone's food logs and I can then kind of make some decisions based on that. But I work on the assumption to start with that someone's cravings is coming from a physiological perspective. So let's start with getting you to be eating more consistently, and working out how often you need to be eating, to be looking at what are the foods that actually support you and keep your energy going for a longer time, to getting people sort of stopping with sort of arbitrary food rules about good and bad foods in absolute terms and starting to understand what works for them. And what I find that when I do with this with people, most of the time this takes care of their cravings. And really they're then coming back to me and they're like, I'm just not actually craving sugar the same way as I was. I'm not eating anywhere near as much chocolate as I was, etc. And there becomes this distinction where they are like, you know what, I still enjoy eating that food, but it's different. And there's a difference between, oh, I kind of fancy that and I'm going to have it, and oh my God, I must have that and I feel a slave to it. And what I find is when people are starting to support their body from a physiological perspective, their cravings are more about, oh, I fancy that, as opposed to I definitely, like I need, I must. So I start as part of that assumption from a physiological perspective. And if they're then doing those things, they're eating more, they're eating consistently, they're starting to support their body, but they're still getting the cravings, then we can start to then look at the emotional side of things, their patterns of behavior, their thought patterns. We can start to look at, okay, what is happening before you get the craving? When are they coming up? What is the environment? Like, is it at work? Is it at home? What times of the day is it normally happening? What foods is it for? What are things that you can identify that sort of trigger you or set you off? Have you always craved these foods? Or what is the earliest memories you have of having these foods? And so we start to then kind of pick apart sort of where this emotional side is coming from. And there's kind of two sort of ideas I want to just share with you that I kind of use when looking at this. And I would say I use this not just for cravings, but to do with sort of all people's issues around food. And The first is idea that came from Scott Abel, and he talks about sort of 5 different mood states that can impact on someone sort of choosing to use food as sort of an external device to deal with sort of internal and emotional issues. So the first is kind of false highs and feeling of entitlement to indulges, as in sort of, I deserve this. The second is sort of unnecessarily lows that people bring upon themselves. So I'm all alone, no one cares about me. And so the only means to then relieve that sort of anxiety around food is to have a food indulgence or to have a food deprivation. So if we're thinking about it from a cravings perspective or a food addiction perspective, it would be to then be having a food indulgence as part of that. The next mood state is to do with numbness, in the sense of there's just so much stress going on for me right now from just so many sources that I'm just overwhelmed and I feel sort of alienated from connection within myself. So the way that I want to deal with this is just to have sort of a food indulgence, or be having food, but it be my sort of mental preoccupation. So it serves as a kind of mute button, so they don't have to be then dealing with all of this other stuff. It can just numb that stuff out. The other one, or the fourth one, is sort of emotional avoidance. So someone's got sort of deep or intense emotions that are just really too intense for them to face up with. Or if they just feel so hurt or whatever it may be, they can then use that food indulgence as an external source to sort of self-soothe the soul. And it's then used sort of in this way, in the beginning to sort of take away sort of emotional torment, but in the long run, it kind of leads to more of this. And then the sort of the fifth reason he kind of states is emotional confusion. When people have just kind of lost the ability to properly label what an emotion is. And because they can't sort of label what's going on, they just can't feel it properly in order to be able to deal with it and let go. So in this case, they're then using sort of food to sort of simplify that confusion. And so you then kind of don't know what's going on, but if I have this food indulgence, I can then beat myself up about the food indulgence. I can still have that emotion, but at least I've been able to kind of label it and give it a reason, as opposed to before where I'm just so confused and I have no idea what's going on. So those kind of different states can be why people can get into kind of cravings or be using sort of food to deal with emotions, to be sort of using food addiction, or why food can become sort of addictive in inverted commas. The other way I look at things is through sort of, it's a concept that was brought to me by Tony Robbins, and he talks about sort of the 6 human needs that we all have. And one of the things that he always says is that people keep their problems for a reason. And I'm a big believer in this. And from working with lots of clients, I've come to realize that this is the case. People don't do things for sort of reasons when people say to me, like, I don't understand why I'm doing this. This benefits me in no way whatsoever. When we start to dig deeper, it's like, no, it does actually benefit you in lots of different ways, and we go through it. And so with these sort of 6 human needs that Tony Robbins talks about, he says that we have these needs, we all will try and meet them in one way or another, and that can be both positive, negative, or neutral, but we'll find ways to meet them. And it's the first 4 needs that we will always find ways to meet, and then the other 2 will just depend on the situation. So the 6 human needs, one is certainty, one is variety, one is significance, the next is sort of love and connection, then growth, and then contribution. And so when people are getting sort of their cravings and when they're getting problems around food, it normally links into, you know what, when everything is feeling uncertain, I'm able to turn to food, so it then meets my need for certainty. Or in terms of variety, which variety is just a change of state. So when I'm feeling kind of really horrible, I know I can turn to food and it's able to change my state, even if it is just for momentarily. In terms of significance, it can be from lots of different angles. And significance can be, I've got this huge problem. If anyone else had this massive problem that I have to deal with on a daily basis, they wouldn't be able to get through it, but I'm able to cope. And so their problems around food becomes their way of sort of significance. And I'm just kind of giving you sort of examples here. These aren't sort of the only ways. These aren't the only kind of way that this can be interpreted, but it's just a nice way I find of looking at why people are doing the behaviors they're doing when they often tell me that there is no reason, it's not serving them at all. And then we look at it in this way and they're like, oh, actually, it does help me. In terms of love and connection, a lot of times when I speak to people, they're like, if I got over this, my partner would leave me. And it's as irrational, but it's like, I need to be in a situation where I'm kind of helpless and need to be saved. Otherwise, my partner's going to leave. And again, this isn't the only way people get love and connection through this, but it's just one of the ways that I found to happen quite regularly. So I think both of these can be sort of applicable concepts when talking about sort of food cravings, when looking at why people have issues around food. But it's not just about this. It can be applying to sort of all different areas of life. So if we move on from sort of cravings and now look at sort of food addiction, what I want to do to start with is to look at sort of drug addiction and sort of the war on drugs, because I think this gives you a kind of a real idea of sort of my position on food addiction. And I would also add to that considering drug addiction is often the thing that food addiction is sort of compared to. I'll hopefully show some of the holes in these kind of ideas. So if you go back to the 18th of June, 1971, President Nixon held a press conference. And it was on this day that he declared drug abuse was public enemy number one. And this is what started what was known as the war on drugs, and it's really been going on ever since. And part of the impetus for this was the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, the number of soldiers that were using sort of opiate products on a regular basis was worryingly high. And in the early stages of war, sort of marijuana was being used fairly commonly, but from about 1969 onwards, heroin and opium became much more of an issue. And there was a report that was done in 1971 that estimated that half of US soldiers had tried opiates, and another report from that same year claimed that sort of 15% of the troops were addicted. So the US government were really concerned that when the war ended, that there would be a steep rise in the number of addicts within America as these soldiers then returned home. So this fear of addiction was largely based on a lot of experiments that were done on rats. And there were lots of different experiments that they were done, but they were all kind of similar in their way of looking at things. So let me give you sort of two examples. First, sort of in example one, you put a rat in a cage on its own. It has sort of two water bottles. One of those water bottles is just water. The other is water that is laced with heroin or cocaine or whatever drug they're testing. And as time goes on, the rat will become obsessed with the drugged water and keep going back to it for more and more. Therefore, drugs are very addictive. In example 2, they put an injection apparatus into the back of the rat. They then tether it to the cage so it can't move. Again, the rat is in a tiny cage and it's on its own. They then provide the rat with a lever that when it's pressed, they get an injection of heroin or cocaine. And just like in the first example, the rats will continue to sort of press that lever, therefore demonstrating how addictive drugs are. So the research sort of going along was sort of these lines, and it was because of this that with the sort of Vietnam War, they were then thinking, my God, this is then going to be the same thing that happens in humans. But was this really correct? And in the 1970s, there was a professor in sort of psychology in Vancouver called Bruce Alexander, and he decided to do his own experiments with rats and drugs. And he noticed that the rats in the original experiments weren't living in a sort of realistic and normal way. They were put in cages on loan. They had nothing to do but take drugs. So he wanted to see what would happen if you put rats in a different environment. So he built this thing called the rat park. and it was over 200 times the floor area of a standard laboratory cage. There were 16 to 20 rats of different sexes in residence. There was an abundance of foods. There was sort of balls and wheels for them to play on, sort of enough space for them to sort of be mating and raising litters. Like, this was sort of Club Med for rats. And so what they did is they took rats who had been sort of force-fed morphine for up to 57 consecutive days in these tiny cages, and they brought them into the rat park and they released them into this new environment. They were then given the choice between sort of plain tap water and water that was laced with morphine. And for the most part, they would then choose the plain water and were able to kick their previous addiction. And to quote Professor Alexander, "Nothing we tried produced anything that looked like addiction in rats when housed in a reasonably normal environment." And while this experiment was done in the 1970s, this had already been seen in real life in the earlier part of that decade. And ironically, the war on drugs was sort of largely created because of the Vietnam War and the fear of what would happen when these people returned. But they actually saw the same response as they saw in the rat park. The vast majority of Vietnam vets who returned home, they immediately ceased opium use, and mostly without sort of noticeable withdrawal symptoms. And obviously availability played a role in this, but it wasn't just that. By returning from a high-stress environment, like a war zone in a foreign country, to a low-stress environment, say there's jubilation of being home, being with your family, with your friends, it eliminated the need for regular use of drugs and would have on its own created its own high. So there's this great TED talk by a guy called Carl Hart, who is a professor at Columbia University. He's known for his research on drug addiction and drug abuse. I'll link to the talk in the show notes for this show. And he talks about the fact that the majority of people who use illicit drugs are recreational users. And this is for things like crack cocaine, for heroin, drugs that are meant to be so strong that you have them once and you're instantly addicted. And he said that when he discovered this, he was just kind of blown away because this is not what everyone is being told. And he had some statistics that sort of like 90% of people who are using illicit drugs aren't drug addicts. And I would say from other documentaries and from other things I've watched that these figures are much, much higher than that. And so if drugs aren't nearly as addictive as they made out to be, and especially drugs like crack cocaine and heroin, then what makes someone become an addict? And the answer to this very much is environmental factors. So another person who I really respect and like in this field is a guy called Dr. Gabor Mate or Gabor Mate. I'm not sure how you pronounce his surname. He's a specialist in drug addiction. He works with addicts in downtown Eastside in Vancouver. And in his book, it's called In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost, he talks about the drug addicts that he sees. And he says that sort of 99% of them have had absolutely horrific upbringings. So they've been abused. They've had physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse. They're kids who were in foster homes, who had parents who were addicts, had parents who were prostitutes, kids who became orphans. Like people who have just a huge amount of pain going on in their life, who really struggle with self-image and with self-worth. And what is interesting is when I read someone like Janine Roth, and Janine Roth is a person who works a lot with people with compulsive eating and with emotional eating, she draws the exact same parallels as with drug addiction. And she puts on workshops all throughout the year. And she says that within her workshops, again, like 95% of the people who are there are people who are coming to her who have had the same kind of horrible, tough, horrific upbringings. People who have been abused, people who have had parents die, who have been had parents who are addicts, etc. And so these are people who have then ended up being kind of compulsive eaters or having issues around food. And a lot of this is coming from the fact that they've had such a terrible and troubled sort of upbringing. And I don't want to be kind of making the assumption that anyone who becomes sort of addicted to food or struggles with food or becomes a drug addict is because they've been abused or because they've had such a horrible upbringing. That's definitely not the case. But it's the fact that environmental factors are really the deciding factor in it. It's not because sort of drugs or food are just so inherently addictive that if you have that stuff, that it's like there's no way you can get away with it. And so if we look at sort of why food often gets compared to sort of drug addiction, a lot of it is because when you look at it from a brain perspective, it lights up a lot of the same pleasure centers in the brain as drugs do. So when you eat food, when you eat sugar, when you eat chocolate, it lights up the same pleasure centers in the brain as when someone does heroin or cocaine. There is a great website called Your Brain on Porn. Again, I'll put the link in the show notes. And sort of as the name suggests, it looks at what happens when people watch porn, and sort of more specifically, what happens when someone becomes a porn addict. I would say it's definitely worth looking at if someone's wanting to understand more about sort of the addiction process from a chemical perspective within the brain. And this is definitely not the only part of it, but at least it sort of explains that side of things, and it can explain why food and drugs can be sort of put in the same category in terms of turning on certain processes within the brain. But what I would add to that is just because something lights up the pleasure centers in the brain doesn't instantly mean that it is addictive. Because if we look at other things that light up pleasure centers in the brain, sex, carbohydrates, fats, water, sunlight, spending time in nature, meditation, music, dance, movement, exercise. So if we are meant to be wary about all the things that light up the pleasure centers in the brain, then we should be also wary about all of these other things. And we should be then kind of thinking about them as bad in the same way as we think about this highly addictive sugar and processed foods, etc. But if you look at the reason behind why most of this stuff kind of lights up the pleasure centers in the brain, it's for the betterment of our species and for survival. If there was no pleasure from eating, we wouldn't have that same desire to go out and to find food. And I know we now live in a society where there's abundance and there's food on our doorsteps and you can get it anywhere you turn, but that hasn't always been the way. The same thing with sex. If there was no enjoyment that came from sex, then we wouldn't be doing it and we wouldn't kind of be able to procreate as a species. So a lot of the things that light up the pleasure centers in our brain are there from a survival perspective. So I think that's just to say because sugar or junk food lights up these pleasure centers, that it's just as addictive as drugs is really wrong. And look, don't get me wrong, like there is a lot of evidence to show that eating sort of highly palatable foods like processed foods can make people overconsume calories. But to go from this place to a place where food has become addictive, it takes other environmental factors like deprivation or abuse or choosing food for emotional reasons. It's not the food on its own. And so in the movie Fed Up, which is the movie produced by sort of Mark Hyman, a lot of the focus is on the fact that food that is fed to kids at school is just such poor quality. And this is something I definitely do agree with because availability does have an impact on consumption. If you're in a situation where the only food that's fed to you during the day is fast food or that's the only thing that's available, then that's what kids are going to eat. And if better quality food is made available, then yeah, they're going to probably eat the better quality food. So this part I definitely do agree with. But to then say that the problem is because sugar is more addictive than cocaine is then sort of hyperbole and sort of really sensationalist tactics. And if we go back to Dr. Gabor Mate's book, he actually tells a really personal account of this about his own struggles with addiction. And you want to know what his struggles with addiction were? It's not alcohol, it's not drugs, it's not sex, it's not gambling. It's buying classical music CDs. And he talks about the phases that he goes through with this as an addiction in terms of buying classical music CDs and going to different shops. where he should be at a meeting, where he should be helping out a client. He talks about the fact that during someone's birth, where he was meant to be there helping with the birth, he left them. And he left them and told them an excuse that he had to go with some other client, and then spent time out buying CDs. And he talks about he'll have days or weeks where he's spending thousands of dollars at a time on classical CDs. And he's then having to hide them in his car, hide them in the attic, hide them from his wife. And it's really strange when I was reading this, because it really starts to make you rethink about addiction, because most people just think, okay, it can't be, how can you be addicted to buying classical CDs? But he explains the whole process with it, and his addiction with that is the exact same as someone with a heroin addiction or someone with a cocaine addiction or a drug addiction. It is the same process. He has the same things go through his body, the same thought processes, etc. And so what this really demonstrates is, at the heart of addiction, it's about changing someone's state and someone using whatever substance or whatever means as their best way of coping with a situation. And for so many people, this ends up being food, but it could so easily be something else. And so why then is it more likely these days that food ends up being the thing that people are sort of addicted to, in inverted commas? And I think from my perspective, it's because food is no longer food anymore. Like, how someone eats is a statement about who they are. Food has become just so linked into someone's body weight, and for so many, how much they weigh and how they look is a direct link into their self-worth. And for often, from a lot of people, it's the most important determiner of their self-worth. And in our society of sort of thin privilege and really stigmatizing fat people, this has a real role to play in why people feel so kind of crazy around food. And like, food in our society has become this real dichotomy between sort of an abundance and then deprivation, between sort of pleasure and then sort of restraint and willpower. And there's just such mixed messages about it that it's become this huge focal point in people's life when it really doesn't need to be. And really, the best way to make someone kind of crazy around food and to sort of feel powerless around it is to deprive themselves of it, and deprive themselves both from a physical perspective but also from an emotional perspective. Because if you do that and you keep that up long enough, it then just leads to people eventually giving in and consuming and then feeling like a failure and coming up with the assumption that food is addictive and I can't control my cravings and I'm sort of powerless around food. And I think that for a lot of people, problems with food are much more sort of socially acceptable than drug problems. And often when I'm talking to clients, when I compare what they're going through to sort of drug addiction, I can see them recoil and they hate that comparison. And there's this feeling of like, I don't do drugs. Drugs are bad. And so for many people, sort of drugs are totally off limits because of their beliefs around drugs. But so something like food, well, that's kind of more okay. And I would say with food is there is no avoiding it. You can live a life where you don't do drugs. You can live a life where you never smoke or you never gamble or you'll never drink alcohol. But you can't live a life where you don't eat food. And so it means that that thing is always going to be in that forefront. And so it's much more likely that that's then going to be an issue. And so while I do think that food can have addictive properties, so can lots of activities in our lives that we don't label as addictive. So for me, calling food addictive really gives so much power to it. It takes away our sense of control. It leads to sort of more fear around food. And this kind of like worry and panic is what tends to lead people to have issues around food that eventually gets called addiction. So rather than thinking of the substance, i.e. food or drugs or gambling, as being sort of the issue, I tend to see it as someone's coping mechanism. And simply removing that substance doesn't really change anything. You've now just removed someone's crutch. So the real way of dealing with it is understanding why someone is making the choices that they are. What are they trying to deal with? What are they trying to avoid? So rather than just removing the food, it's like, what are you trying to be dealing with here, and what could we be doing in different ways, or how could we be thinking about this differently so you're not needing to do this? And there's a great quote in the realm of the Hungry Ghost that states addiction has biological, chemical, neurological, physiological, medical, emotional, social, political, economic, and spiritual underpinnings, and perhaps others I haven't thought about. To get anywhere near a complete picture, we must keep shaking the kaleidoscope to see what other patterns emerge. And to me, this just really sums up the multifaceted nature of addiction. And ignoring all this and just kind of throwing the problem solely at the feet of food being sort of so addictive really misses all of this. Because you are kind of getting into the same realm as then sort of the war on drugs. And if we just cut off the drug supply, then we're going to be able to solve the problem. And if you look at how successful the war on drugs has really been, you'll realize that it's been pretty much a total disaster. And it hasn't helped to deal with the problem of drug addiction. So that's it for the podcast for today. I know some of that was maybe kind of a little bit heavy, but from my perspective, I really want people to be changing their relationship with food. And for a lot of that, it means getting away from the fear of food and the fear of kind of food being so addictive and starting to look at what's going on in someone's life, why people are choosing to eat the way that they do, why is someone getting the cravings, and is it from an emotional perspective, is it from a physiological perspective, etc. So until next time, have a good week, and I'll catch you then.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.